Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we are going to follow water, not chase it, not study it under harsh light, but simply follow it, the way you might follow a familiar path in the dark, trusting your feet more than your eyes. We are going to think about rivers tonight, the quiet, unhurried, endlessly patient threads of water that lace across every continent on this earth, carrying with them the memory of mountains, the weight of centuries, and the soft, ceaseless sound that has lulled human beings to sleep since long before there were beds or houses or roofs to keep the stars away. A river is one of the oldest sounds there is. Before there was music, there was the sound of water moving over stone. Before there were lullabies sung by human voices, there was the low, steady murmur of a current finding its way downhill, night after night, indifferent to whether anyone was listening, and yet somehow always sounding as though it were speaking gently to whoever happened to be nearby. Tonight, you're the one nearby. Tonight, the river is speaking to you. There is something remarkable about a river that is easy to forget in the business of ordinary life. A river is never finished. It is never a fixed thing, the way a mountain feels fixed, or a building feels fixed. A river is a process, caught forever in the middle of becoming. It is water that fell from clouds days or months or centuries ago, gathering itself in high, cold places and beginning a journey that it will not finish for a very long time, if it ever finishes at all. Tonight we will walk gently alongside that journey. We won't rush it, and we won't try to reach the end. We'll simply notice, one soft observation at a time, what a river is and what it does, and why it has meant so much to human beings for as long as there have been human beings to mean anything at all. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Before we begin, let your shoulders soften just a little. You may not have noticed how high you are holding them. Let them drop gently, the way a river drops from a mountain, not suddenly, not with any urgency, but slowly, easily, the way water always finds the direction of least resistance. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing to solve tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. You can let your eyes close whenever they are ready and simply listen, the way you might listen to a river from the far bank, feeling the story move past you rather than needing to hold on to any of it. Let's begin. Rivers begin almost always with something falling. It is a strange thought to sit with. Somewhere high above sea level on a mountain slope inside a glacier, deep within a limestone cave, a single drop of water begins to move. It might have fallen as rain the day before. It might have been locked inside ice for 10,000 years before finally being released by a warming spring. Either way, that single drop has no idea, of course, that it is about to become part of something vast. It simply moves the way water always moves, downward, following the shape of the land beneath it, joining with other drops that are doing exactly the same thing, and slowly, without any plan or intention, thousands and then millions and then billions of these small, unremarkable drops begin to organize themselves into something we would recognize as a river. There is a gentle lesson in that if you want one, though you don't have to take it. Something enormous can begin from something almost too small to notice. You don't need to hold that thought tightly. Just let it rest somewhere in the back of your mind, the way a smooth stone might rest in the palm of your hand. The place where a river begins is called its source, and sources are wonderfully varied. Some rivers begin at glaciers, where ancient compressed snow slowly melts at its edges, releasing water that has been sealed away for centuries or millennia. The Ganges, sacred to hundreds of millions of people, begins this way, emerging from beneath a Himalayan glacier called Gangotri, where the ice cave itself has been retreating slowly over the decades, its blue-white mouth opening a little further into the mountain each year. Other rivers begin at springs, where groundwater that has been travelling invisibly beneath the Earth's surface finally finds a crack or a fissure and rises up into the open air, sometimes so gently that you would hardly notice the moment it becomes a stream rather than simply wet ground. Still other rivers begin high in mountain snowfields, fed by nothing more dramatic than the sun's daily warmth loosening a little more snow each afternoon, sending meltwater trickling downhill in threads too small to have names. There is something soothing in knowing that a river's beginning is rarely announced. There is no single dramatic moment when a mountain says, "Here, this is where my river starts." Instead, there is a slow gathering, a coming together of many small and quiet sources, until eventually there is enough water, moving in enough of the same direction, that we are willing to give it a name. Let us move on now to something a little more physical, a little more felt the way a river actually moves across the land, and why it moves the way it does. Water, as you likely already understand in some quiet, unspoken way, is always trying to go downhill. This is an ambition or desire in any sense we would recognize. It's simply gravity, patient and impartial, pulling every drop of water toward the lowest point it can reach. But land is rarely a smooth, even slope, and so a river's path is never a straight line. It bends around resistant rock. It curves where the land tilts slightly to one side. It hesitates in low, flat places, spreading wide and slow before gathering itself again where the land steepens and narrows. This gives rivers their characteristic winding shape, what geographers call a meander, a word that comes from an ancient river in what is now Turkey, the Meander, whose curves were so famous in antiquity that the river's own name became the word we still use for wandering, unhurried movement. It is a lovely thing to consider that our word for taking our time, for moving without a fixed destination in mind, comes directly from watching a river do exactly that. Meanders are not random, even though they may look that way from above. When water moves around a bend, it moves faster along the outer edge of the curve and slower along the inner edge. The faster water on the outside erodes the riverbank, cutting it away grain by grain, while the slower water on the inside deposits sediment, building the bank up. Over years and then decades and then centuries, this process causes the meander to travel sideways across the landscape, the outer bank retreating while the inner bank grows, so that the entire loop of the river appears to migrate slowly across the floodplain, like something breathing very, very slowly. Sometimes, if you let your mind rest on this image for a moment, a meander becomes so pronounced, so nearly circular, that the river eventually cuts across its own narrow neck during a flood, taking a shortcut and abandoning the old loop entirely. What's left behind is called an oxbow lake, a curved, quiet body of water, cut off now from the main current, slowly filling with sediment and reeds and the calls of water birds who have no idea and no reason to care that this particular pond used to be a river. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little if they have risen while you are picturing that great slow bending of water across the land. You are in no hurry, neither is this world we are exploring together. From here, the story shifts to something gentler still, the sound of a river, and why that sound has always been so easy for the human mind to rest inside. If you have ever fallen asleep near moving water, you may have noticed something curious. The sound never quite repeats itself, and yet it never surprises you either. Each gurgle, each soft slap of water against stone, each low murmur where the current deepens is slightly different from the one before it, and yet the overall texture of the sound stays remarkably consistent. Researchers who study sound and sleep have found that this quality randomness within a stable, predictable range is part of what makes flowing water such an effective aid to rest. Unlike a sudden noise, which the brain must evaluate for possible danger, the gentle unpredictability of river sound offers nothing to evaluate. There is no pattern to break, and so there is no reason for the alert, watchful part of the mind to stay engaged. It can simply let go, trusting that whatever happens next will be more or less exactly like what just happened. This is sometimes called pink noise, distinct from the flatter, more uniform quality of white noise. Pink noise carries more of its energy in the lower frequencies, giving it a fuller, deeper, more natural texture closer to rainfall, or wind through leaves, or, of course, a river moving steadily over its bed. Some studies suggest that this kind of sound may support the slow brain waves associated with the deepest stages of sleep, though scientists are still exploring exactly how and why. It is one of those pleasant uncertainties of science, the kind that adds a little wonder rather than taking anything away. We don't need to know precisely why a river's voice is so easy to rest inside. We only need to notice that it is. It is worth pausing here for a moment to think about scale, because rivers exist at almost every scale imaginable, from a thread of snowmelt you could step across without noticing, to something so vast it reshapes the very idea of what a river can be. Consider the Amazon, moving through the heart of South America, with a volume of water so immense that it accounts for something close to 1/5 of all the fresh water that flows into the world's oceans from every river combined. Stand at its mouth, where it meets the Atlantic, and you would be hard-pressed to see the far shore. Even on a clear day, the river there is so wide, so heavy with the accumulated waters of thousands of smaller tributaries, that it behaves less like a river and more like an inland sea in motion. Its flow is so powerful that it pushes fresh water more than 100 miles out into the salt ocean before finally surrendering and mixing with the sea. Sailors have reported being able to drink fresh water from buckets lowered over the side of their ships while still out of sight of land, the river's presence detectable long before the coastline ever becomes visible. And yet, beneath all of this grandeur, there is something quietly moving about the fact that the Amazon too began as countless small unremarkable trickles high in the Andes, in places so cold and thin-aired that nothing about them would suggest the tropical abundance that lies thousands of miles downstream. The largest things in the world so often begin this way modestly, invisibly, in places no one thought to watch closely. There is something else worth considering, and it has to do with time rather than size. Rivers are old, not old the way a grandparent is old, or even old the way an ancient tree is old, but old in a way that stretches the imagination gently past its usual limits. Geologists studying the New River, which flows through the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States, believe it may be one of the oldest rivers on the planet, with some estimates suggesting its course has remained largely unchanged for well over 100 million years, meaning this particular pattern of flowing water was already old when dinosaurs were walking the earth, and has simply continued its unhurried work ever since, wearing down the very mountains around it more patiently than mountains could ever resist. There is something wonderfully humbling in that. A river, unlike almost anything else we might call soft or gentle, is one of the most powerful forces of change on the entire planet, and yet it achieves this power not through force, not through violence, but through simple, endless repetition. Drop after drop after drop for millions of years, wearing stone the way patience wears away worry, until eventually there is a canyon where there used to be a plain, or a valley where there used to be a mountain. If your eyes are growing heavy now, that is perfectly fine. Let them close. The story will carry on around you, the way a river carries on whether or not anyone happens to be standing on its bank at any given moment. You don't need to follow every word. You can simply let the sound of this settle over you, the way mist settles over a river valley in the early morning, without any effort at all. Let us move gently now towards something a little more historical, the way human beings have shaped their lives, their cities, and their entire civilizations around the presence of moving water. It is not an exaggeration to say that human history is, in large part, a history of rivers. Nearly every early civilization we know of took root along a major river system, not by coincidence, but by necessity. The Nile, moving steadily northward through what is now Egypt, flooded predictably each year, depositing a thin, dark layer of nutrient-rich silt across the surrounding fields. Ancient Egyptian farmers came to depend on this flood so completely that their entire calendar was built around it. A season of inundation, a season of growth, and a season of harvest, repeating endlessly, as reliable as the stars. The river's generosity made possible some of the earliest large cities, the earliest system of centralized government, and some of the oldest surviving monuments human beings have ever built. All of it, in some sense, owed its existence to the patient, seasonal rhythm of water moving from the highlands of East Africa down to the Mediterranean Sea. A similar story unfolded between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the region often called the cradle of civilization, where the earliest known writing systems, the earliest known legal codes, and some of the earliest known cities all emerged along riverbanks whose waters made farming possible in what would otherwise have been an unforgiving desert landscape. And further east, the Indus River supported one of the largest and most sophisticated early urban civilizations, one whose cities featured remarkably advanced water management systems, covered drains, public baths, and carefully planned streets, suggesting that even 5,000 years ago, human beings understood, on some deep level, that a good relationship with water was the foundation of everything else. It is worth pausing here to notice something gentle in this pattern. In each of these ancient river valleys, human beings were not conquering the water. They were listening to it, learning its rhythms, adapting their entire way of life to its patient seasonal voice. The river set the terms, and civilization arranged itself accordingly. There is something almost restful in imagining that relationship, not a battle against nature, but a long, careful conversation with it, conducted over centuries, one flood season at a time, which brings us gently to a smaller and more intimate scale, the life that exists within a river itself, day to day, often unnoticed by anyone standing on the bank above. A healthy river is remarkably crowded, though it rarely looks that way from above. Beneath the surface, in the cool, oxygen-rich water, countless small creatures go about their business with the same unhurried persistence as the river itself. Insect larvae cling to the undersides of stones, waiting patiently through months of development before finally emerging, briefly, as adult mayflies or caddisflies, living out the winged portion of their lives in a matter of hours or days before the cycle begins again. Fish move against the current or with it, depending on the season and the task at hand, their bodies shaped by millions of years of evolution into something almost perfectly suited to a life spent swimming through moving water. Few stories in the natural world capture this rhythm of patience and return quite like the journey of the salmon. Born in the gentle upper reaches of a river, tiny and vulnerable, young salmon eventually make their way downstream toward the sea, undergoing a remarkable physical transformation along the way that allows their bodies to shift from living in fresh water to living in salt water. They spend years out in the vast wide ocean, growing strong, before something inside them, something scientists still do not fully understand, though they suspect it involves an extraordinary sensitivity to the particular chemical signature of their home water calls them back. They return against the current, sometimes swimming hundreds of miles upstream, leaping up small waterfalls and rapids, driven by an urge that asks nothing of them except to arrive at the exact same stretch of gravel where their own lives began. There is no need to dwell on what comes after that long journey. It is enough tonight to simply hold the image of the salmon moving upstream, patient and certain, guided home by nothing more than the quiet particular voice of the water it was born into. It is one of the more moving reminders that a river is not simply a place. For some creatures, it is something closer to a memory carried in the body, calling gently across years and thousands of miles. Allow your breathing to find its own slow rhythm as we continue. There is no need to hurry through any of this. From here, the story shifts to the many different kinds of rivers found around the world, because not every river behaves the way we might imagine when we picture a wide, calm current moving steadily through green countryside. Consider the rivers of the desert, sometimes called wadis in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, or arroyos in the American Southwest. For most of the year, these riverbeds appear entirely dry, nothing more than a wide channel of sand and stone winding across an otherwise barren landscape. And yet, when rain does come often suddenly, often far away, sometimes falling on distant mountains, the observer cannot even see these dry channels can transform within minutes into powerful, temporary rivers, carrying enormous volumes of water across the desert before the ground absorbs it, or the sun evaporates it, and the riverbed returns once more to stillness. There is something quietly profound in the idea of a river that exists only intermittently, appearing and disappearing according to the whims of distant weather, and yet still shaping the land generation after generation, exactly as faithfully as any river that flows every day of the year. Then there are subterranean rivers, flowing entirely out of sight beneath the surface of the earth, carved through limestone over thousands of years by the same patient chemistry that creates caves. In places like the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, these underground rivers connect vast networks of flooded caverns, some of which remain almost entirely unexplored, their waters so still and so clear that a diver's light can travel remarkable distances through them, illuminating stone formations that have never been touched by direct sunlight. It is a strange and beautiful thought that somewhere beneath your feet, in various places around the world, rivers are moving right now through complete darkness, following paths shaped over millennia, entirely unseen, entirely uncelebrated, and yet just as real and just as patient as any river beneath an open sky. And there are tidal rivers, found near coastlines, where the ordinary downstream flow of fresh water meets the daily rhythm of the ocean's tides. Twice a day, the incoming tide pushes back against the river's current, sometimes so strongly that the river appears for a few hours to reverse its direction entirely, flowing inland instead of out to sea. In a few rare and famous cases, this incoming tide arrives as a single travelling wave known as a tidal bore, moving upriver against the current with a low, steady roar, a phenomenon that has fascinated observers for centuries and that some surfers now travel great distances simply to ride. There is something else worth considering here, something a little more delicate, the quiet, often invisible relationship between a river and the wetlands that so often surround it. Where a river slows, particularly near its mouth, it frequently spreads out into a wide, complex network of marshes, swamps, and shallow channels collectively known as a delta. The Mississippi River Delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, the Nile Delta, each represents thousands of years of accumulated sediment, carried patiently downstream grain by grain and deposited exactly where the river's energy finally runs low enough to let it settle. These deltas are among the most productive ecosystems on the planet, nurseries for countless species of fish, resting points for migratory birds traveling unimaginable distances between continents, and historically some of the most fertile agricultural land available to the human beings lucky enough to live nearby. There is a particular kind of forest that thrives in some of these delta environments, especially in warmer regions, the mangrove, a tree uniquely adapted to living with its roots partly submerged in a mixture of fresh and salt water. Mangrove roots rise above the waterline in tangled and arching shapes, creating a maze-like structure that shelters young fish, crabs, and countless other small creatures from larger predators. These forests also do something remarkably valuable and remarkably quiet. They absorb the energy of storms and waves before those forces ever reach the shore, protecting the coastline the way a soft cushion protects something fragile inside a box. It is a lovely thing to picture, if you'd like to picture anything at all right now, a dense, tangled forest standing patiently at the boundary between river and sea, absorbing the world's rougher edges so that everything behind it can remain calm. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little if they have risen. You're in no hurry, neither is this world we're exploring together. Let us move on now to the way rivers have carried not just water, but people, ideas, goods, and stories across vast distances throughout human history. Long before there were highways, or railways, or airplanes, rivers were the original roads of the world, and in many ways they were superior roads, requiring no construction at all beyond the simple act of building a boat. The Nile made it possible to move enormous stone blocks for the construction of the pyramids, floated on barges during flood season when the water rose high enough to carry them close to the construction sites. The rivers of Mesopotamia allowed early trade networks to flourish, connecting distant cities and cultures in a slow, steady exchange of goods, language, and ideas. The great rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, supported not only agriculture, but also an intricate system of canals and waterways that, at various points in history, formed some of the most extensive transportation networks the ancient world had ever seen. Even in more recent centuries, rivers continued to shape the movement of human life. In North America, the Mississippi River system became the backbone of an entire economy, carrying goods from the interior of the continent down toward the port of New Orleans and out into the wider world. The steamboats that once traveled its waters, with their tall smokestacks and their slow rhythmic paddle wheels, carried not only cotton and grain but also music, stories and cultures that blended and travelled together along the river's long, winding path, contributing to musical traditions that continue to shape American culture today. There is something quietly moving in recognizing how much of human connection, trade, storytelling, migration, the simple act of one community learning about another, has depended throughout history on the patient, unhurried movement of river water. Long before anyone could fly across an ocean or speak instantly to someone on the other side of the world, a river was often the fastest, gentlest way for one place to learn about another. There is something else worth considering, and it returns us to something small and intimate, the particular quality of light on moving water, something painters have tried to capture for centuries without ever quite succeeding. If you have ever watched sunlight on a river's surface, you may have noticed how it never holds still. Unlike sunlight on a calm lake, which might create one broad, steady shimmer, sunlight on a moving river breaks into countless small, shifting fragments, each one catching and releasing the light in its own moment before dissolving into the next ripple. Painters of the Impressionist movement in the late 19th century became particularly fascinated by this quality of light, spending entire careers trying to capture not the river itself, but the fleeting, ever-changing impression it made on the eye in a single instant. Claude Monet painted the Seine and its surrounding waterways dozens of times, across different seasons and different hours of the day, not because the river had changed, but because the light on the river was never, ever the same twice. There is something worth sitting with in that idea, if only for a moment. A river's surface is a kind of honest mirror not because it reflects things perfectly, but because it refuses to reflect anything for more than a fraction of a second before moving on to the next reflection. Perhaps that is part of why watching moving water feels so restful to the human mind. It asks nothing of you. It doesn't need you to remember any particular ripple, or to hold on to any particular flash of light. Each one is allowed to simply happen, and then pass, and then be replaced by the next. From here, the story shifts to something a little more scientific, the physics of how water actually behaves as it moves. Because even something as familiar as a flowing river contains genuine, quiet complexity. Physicists and hydrologists describe river flow in terms of two broad categories: laminar flow and turbulent flow. Laminar flow is smooth and orderly, with water moving in distinct parallel layers that slide past one another without much mixing. This tends to happen in slow-moving deep water, or very close to a smooth riverbed. Turbulent flow, by contrast, is what happens in most rivers most of the time. Chaotic, swirling, unpredictable at the smallest scale, even while the overall movement of the river remains steady and consistent when viewed from a distance. It is a strange and rather beautiful contradiction that a river can be, in its smallest details, wildly unpredictable, full of countless tiny eddies and vortices forming and dissolving every fraction of a second, while still being, in its larger and more meaningful sense, one of the most steady, dependable, patient things in the natural world. There is a gentle metaphor available here, though you're welcome to let it pass by without holding on to it if you'd prefer simply to rest. Perhaps a life too can hold both of these qualities at once: small-scale unpredictability, day-to-day turbulence. And yet, viewed from enough distance, a larger and more dependable direction, moving steadily toward wherever it happens to be going. You don't need to decide whether that's true tonight. You can simply let the thought drift past, the way a leaf might drift past on the surface of a moving river, noticed for a moment and then carried gently on. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider something wonderfully specific: the sound a river makes when it moves over rocks of different sizes, because this too has a kind of hidden order to it. Small pebbles, when water moves quickly over them, tend to produce a higher, brighter, more chattering sound. Larger stones create a deeper, more resonant tone, sometimes almost a low hum beneath the higher sounds around it. Where a river drops suddenly over a ledge, even a small one, the falling water traps tiny bubbles of air. and it is actually the collapse of these countless microscopic air bubbles, rather than the water itself, that produces much of the crisp white noise quality we associate with the sound of a waterfall. Acousticians who study this phenomenon have found that a single small waterfall can generate an extraordinarily rich and complex range of frequencies, all layered together into something the human ear perceives as simple, soothing white or pink noise, even though if you were to isolate any single moment of that sound and study it closely, it would reveal an almost unbelievable amount of acoustic detail. There is something rather wonderful in that if you'd like to hold on to it gently before letting it go. What sounds simple and restful to a tired mind at the end of a long day is, underneath, extraordinarily rich and complex thousands of tiny events, layered together so seamlessly that all we perceive is a single, soft, continuous sound, easy to rest inside, easy to let carry us towards sleep. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little if they have risen. Let your breathing settle into whatever rhythm feels most natural. You're in no hurry. Neither is this world we're exploring together. Let us move on now to the creatures who make their homes not within a river, but alongside it the animals who have built their lives around the presence of moving water, in ways that are, in their own quiet fashion, remarkably clever. Few animals shape a river landscape as thoroughly or as gently as the beaver. Using nothing but branches, mud, and an extraordinary, almost architectural instinct, beavers construct dams across smaller streams, slowing the current and creating wide, calm ponds behind them. This might seem, at first, like an interruption of the river's natural flow, but ecologists have come to understand that beaver dams often create richer, more diverse habitats than the free-flowing stream would have supported on its own. The still water behind a beaver dam allows sediment to settle, creates ideal conditions for aquatic plants, and provides shelter for fish, amphibians, and countless insects that would struggle in faster-moving water. In this sense, the beaver behaves almost like a quiet engineer, working patiently night after night to reshape its small corner of the world into something more hospitable not only for itself, but as it happens, for nearly everything else living nearby as well. Otters too have made an art of life along the river's edge, and there is something particularly heartening in their behaviour, because much of what otters do appears, to any observer, to be simple play. They slide down muddy banks repeatedly, seemingly for no purpose beyond the pleasure of sliding. They toss stones between their paws while floating on their backs. Scientists who study animal behavior generally agree that this playfulness likely does serve practical purposes, developing coordination, strengthening social bonds, practicing skills that will later prove useful in hunting or evading predators. But it is difficult, watching a group of otters slide joyfully down a riverbank again and again, not to feel that some portion of what you're witnessing is simply, straightforwardly, contentment. And above the water, herons stand motionless for what can seem like impossible lengths of time, sometimes remaining nearly still for 20 or 30 minutes, patiently waiting for a fish to drift close enough within range of their long, precise beaks. There is something almost meditative in watching a heron hunt. It does not chase, it does not hurry, it simply waits, with what appears to the human eyes an almost supernatural degree of patience, trusting that the river will eventually bring what it needs, if only it is willing to remain still long enough. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider that patience actually, because it may be one of the quiet lessons a river teaches to everything that lives alongside it. A river does not rush toward the sea, even though the sea is, in some sense, its ultimate destination. It simply keeps moving at whatever pace the land allows, trusting that the destination will arrive in its own time. There is nothing effortful in that. There is nothing anxious in that. It is simply the nature of water to keep moving unhurried until it arrives exactly where it was always going to arrive. And yet, beneath all of this gentle patience, rivers also carry within them an enormous quiet power, the power to shape entire landscapes over time, carving canyons, building deltas, moving mountains one grain of sediment at a time. Nowhere is this more visible than at the Grand Canyon, where the Colorado River has spent roughly 5 to 6 million years cutting downward through layer after layer of rock, exposing nearly 2 billion years of the Earth's geological history in the canyon's exposed walls. Standing at the rim and looking down, a visitor is looking, in a very real sense, backward through time, each coloured band of rock representing a different era, a different ancient environment, a different chapter in the planet's extraordinarily long story. And the river responsible for all of this, when viewed from above, appears astonishingly small and quiet, a thin ribbon of green-brown water winding along the canyon floor, giving no obvious indication of the immense patience and immense power it took to carve such a place. There is something worth sitting with in that contrast, if you'd like to sit with anything at all right now, though you are equally welcome to simply let your mind rest. A river's power rarely announces itself, doesn't need to. Given enough time, and rivers, it turns out, are remarkably good at being given enough time, even the hardest stone eventually yields to something as soft and yielding as water. From here, the story shifts to something warmer, something closer to home in feeling if not in geography, the many ways rivers have found their way into human art, mythology and belief, across nearly every culture that has ever lived near one. In ancient Egypt, the Nile was understood not simply as a body of water, but as something closer to a living god, its annual flood personified as Hapi, a deity of abundance whose generosity determined whether the coming year would bring plenty or hardship. In Hindu tradition, the Ganges is regarded as sacred beyond ordinary description. Believed to have descended from the heavens, its waters considered capable of washing away not only physical dirt but spiritual burden as well, drawing millions of pilgrims each year who travel great distances simply to stand in its current. In ancient Greek mythology, rivers were often imagined as gods themselves, ancient beings older than many of the more famous Olympian deities, their personalities as varied and particular as the rivers they represented. Some gentle, some fierce, each one understood to have its own temperament, its own voice, its own relationship with the humans who lived along its banks. Even outside of formal religion, rivers have carried deep symbolic weight across cultures that never had any contact with one another, which is itself a rather lovely coincidence to consider. Rivers so often represent the passage of time, the journey of a life from birth to death, the idea that we are all, in some sense, moving steadily toward a destination we cannot fully see from where we currently stand. The philosopher Heraclitus, in ancient Greece, is remembered for observing that one can never step into the same river twice, because both the river and the person stepping into it are constantly changing, moment to moment, even when they appear from the outside to remain exactly the same. It is a thought that has echoed across more than 2,000 years, still quoted, still considered, still offering a small, quiet piece of wisdom to anyone willing to sit with it for a moment before drifting on to the next thought, the way a river itself might drift. You are in no hurry, neither is this world we're exploring together. If your eyes are growing heavy now, that is perfectly fine. Let them close. The story will carry on around you. Let us move gently now toward the rivers of far colder places, where water behaves in ways that might seem almost unfamiliar to those of us more accustomed to warmer climates. In the far north, in Siberia, in northern Canada, in Alaska, rivers spend a significant portion of each year locked beneath a thick layer of ice, sometimes several feet thick, strong enough in the depths of winter to support the weight of trucks and even small buildings. And yet, beneath that frozen surface, the river continues to flow, quiet and hidden, moving through the darkness of an Arctic winter exactly as it would in the height of summer, simply unseen, sealed away beneath a ceiling of ice. When spring finally arrives and the ice begins to break apart, it does so with a sound unlike almost anything else in nature. A deep, groaning, cracking chorus that can continue for days as enormous sheets of ice shift, buckle, and eventually break free, carried downstream by the current in a slow, dramatic procession, sometimes called an ice jam, occasionally piling up so thickly against a bend in the river that it temporarily dams the entire flow, creating a sudden flood upstream until the pressure finally forces the ice through. There is something wonderfully patient in the image of a river beneath ice, isn't there? All winter long, through the coldest, darkest months, the water beneath continues its quiet work, unseen, uncelebrated, trusting that spring will come eventually and release it. It doesn't rush against the ice. It doesn't fight the season. It simply continues patiently exactly as it always has, waiting for warmth to return in its own good time. There is something else worth considering, something a little more delicate still. And it concerns the rivers that exist not on our planet at all, but on a small cold moon orbiting Saturn. Titan, Saturn's largest moon, is the only place beyond Earth where scientists have confirmed the presence of stable liquid on the surface, but the liquid in question is not water. Titan is so cold, with surface temperatures hovering around nearly 300 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, that water exists there only as solid, rock-hard ice. Instead, Titan's rivers, lakes, and even rain are made of liquid methane and ethane, chemicals that exist as gases here on Earth but that behave, in Titan's extreme cold, remarkably similarly to how water behaves on our own warmer world. Spacecraft images have revealed river channels on Titan's surface that look, in their overall shape and structure, astonishingly similar to rivers here on Earth, the same winding meanders, the same branching tributary patterns, the same evidence of slow, patient erosion carving channels into the landscape over time. It is a remarkable thought to rest with for a moment, if you'd like to rest with it. Somewhere out there, nearly 1 billion miles from where you are right now, in conditions colder and stranger than almost anywhere on Earth, something is still, in its own fashion, doing exactly what rivers do here, moving steadily downhill, carving paths through a landscape, following the same simple, patient logic that governs moving liquid everywhere in the universe, regardless of what that liquid happens to be made of. The universe, it turns out, is fond of rivers. It seems to build them wherever the conditions allow, using whatever materials happen to be available. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider something closer to home, once more the way a river's mouth, the place where fresh water finally meets the sea, represents one of the most productive and most delicately balanced environments on the entire planet. Where fresh river water meets salt ocean water, the two do not mix immediately or evenly. Because fresh water is slightly less dense than salt water, it often floats for a time on top of the denser seawater, creating a distinct boundary layer, sometimes visible from above as a faint line or shift in watercolor, where the two bodies of water gradually blend together through slow, patient mixing rather than sudden combination. This zone, known as an estuary, supports an extraordinary density of life, because it offers something neither pure fresh water nor pure salt water can offer on its own: a rich, constantly shifting mixture of nutrients brought downstream by the river and stirred together with the nutrients carried in by the tide. Estuaries serve as nurseries for an enormous proportion of the world's commercially important fish species, offering young fish shelter and food in the crucial early stages of their lives before they venture out into the more dangerous, more exposed waters of the open ocean. There is something quietly moving in the idea that a river's ending is also, simultaneously, a beginning for so many other forms of life. The place where the river's long journey concludes is the very same place where countless small creatures begin theirs, hatching, growing, and eventually swimming out into the wider world, carrying forward, in their own way, the same patient, unhurried momentum that carried the river all the way from its distant, high, and quiet source. Allow your breathing to find its own slow rhythm as we continue. There is nothing urgent here. There never was. From here, the story shifts to the way human beings in more recent centuries have both benefited from and struggled to properly care for the rivers that continue to sustain so much of daily life around the world. The construction of large dams throughout the 20th century transformed many of the world's major rivers, providing electricity to millions of homes, water for irrigation across vast agricultural regions, and protection from seasonal flooding for communities that had, for centuries, lived at the mercy of a river's unpredictable moods. The Hoover Dam, completed in the 1930s along the Colorado River, remains one of the most celebrated engineering achievements of its era, its enormous curved wall of concrete holding back a reservoir so large it can be seen clearly from space. And yet, alongside these benefits, engineers, ecologists, and local communities have also learned, gradually and sometimes painfully, that a dammed river behaves quite differently from a free-flowing one. Sediment that once travelled downstream to nourish deltas and wetlands instead settles behind the dam. Fish that once migrated freely upstream to spawn find their ancient paths interrupted, and the natural seasonal rhythm of flood and recession, the very rhythm that shaped so many early civilizations, becomes smoothed out into something more constant, more controlled, and in certain important ecological respects less alive. In recent decades, this understanding has led to a quiet but meaningful shift in how many communities think about rivers. Increasingly, dam removal projects have begun restoring rivers to something closer to their original free-flowing state, allowing long-dormant salmon runs to resume, allowing sediment to once again nourish downstream wetlands, allowing a river, in a sense, to remember how to be a river. The Elwha River in Washington state, once blocked by two large dams for nearly a century, was returned to free flow beginning in 2011, and within just a few years, salmon that had not swum those waters in 100 years began returning to spawn in the river's upper reaches once more, guided by instincts that had apparently been waiting patiently, generation after generation, for the chance to be used again. There is something wonderfully hopeful in that story, if you'd like to hold on to it gently before letting your mind rest. Even after a century of separation, even after 4 or 5 human generations had passed without ever seeing salmon in those particular waters, something in the deep, patient memory of the species remained intact, ready to be called upon the moment the opportunity returned. Rivers, it seems, are remarkably good at remembering how to be themselves, given even the smallest chance. There is something else worth considering here, something small and personal, and it concerns the particular quiet comfort so many people find in simply sitting beside moving water without any agenda beyond simply being present. Psychologists who study what is sometimes called blue space environments centered around water, as distinct from the green space of forests and parks, have found that proximity to moving water tends to produce measurable reductions in stress, along with improvements in mood and a general sense of restoration. Some researchers suggest this may connect to something quite deep in human evolutionary history. For nearly the entirety of our species' existence, reliable access to fresh water has meant survival, and so perhaps some old, patient part of the human brain still registers the sight and sound of a flowing river as a signal of safety, of resources, of a place where life can continue. Whatever the precise explanation, the effect itself is something many people recognize instinctively, even without needing a scientific study to confirm it. There is a reason, after all, that you have chosen to spend part of tonight listening to a voice describe rivers rather than something else entirely. Some old, quiet part of you already knew this would be restful. It is worth pausing here for a moment simply to notice that instinct, without needing to analyze it any further. You don't need to understand exactly why moving water feels calming. You only need to let yourself feel calm if that is what your body is already quietly beginning to do. Let us move on now, gently, toward the way a river changes across the seasons of a single year, because even a river that flows every single day of its existence is never really the same river twice, not even across a single turn of the calendar. In spring in many parts of the world, rivers swell with snowmelt, rising higher and moving faster than at almost any other point in the year, carrying with them sediment and nutrients gathered from the mountains and hillsides above. This seasonal surge, sometimes called the spring freshet, plays a crucial ecological role, flushing accumulated debris from the riverbed, redistributing gravel that fish depend on for spawning, and refreshing the wetlands and floodplains downstream with a new layer of nutrient-rich silt. In summer, as the snowmelt slows and rainfall patterns shift, many rivers settle into a calmer, shallower rhythm, their waters warming slightly under the longer days, supporting a different community of insects and plants than the cold rush of spring allowed. In autumn, fallen leaves drift onto the water's surface in great, slow-moving rafts, some sinking to become part of the riverbed's ecosystem, providing food for the small aquatic creatures that will, in turn, feed the fish that feed the birds that feed whatever comes next in that long, patient chain. And in winter, as we considered a little earlier, many rivers slow and some freeze, entering a quieter season of rest before the entire cycle begins again with the following spring. There is a lovely and quite gentle idea contained in this yearly rhythm, if you'd like to hold on to it before we move toward the closing of tonight's journey. A river is never static, and yet it is also never truly lost. It moves through enormous variation, flood and drought, ice and warmth, rushing spring torrents and slow autumn drifts, and yet it remains, through all of it, recognizably itself, following the same channel shaped by the same banks, governed by the same patient pull of gravity and toward the sea. Perhaps there is something worth borrowing from that the next time change feels overwhelming rather than simply seasonal. A river does not resist its own changes. It moves through each one, trusting that its own essential nature will remain intact on the other side. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little further if they have risen. Let your thoughts loosen their grip a little more, the way a river loosens its grip on a fallen leaf. carrying it along without ever needing to hold it too tightly. We are, I think, nearing the place where this particular current begins to slow, the way a river slows as it approaches the wide, calm water near the sea. Tonight we travelled from a single falling drop, high on a cold mountainside, all the way down to the wide, warm meeting place where a river finally surrenders itself to the ocean. We walked gently, alongside meanders and oxbow lakes, past ancient civilizations that grew up along patient flooding waters, through deserts where rivers appear only when rain allows, and beneath ice sheets where water continues its quiet work entirely out of sight. We considered the salmon, guided home by nothing more than memory and instinct, and the heron, standing motionless, trusting the water to bring what it needs in its own time. We even travelled for a moment, nearly 1 billion miles from here, to a cold moon where rivers of methane carve their own patient paths through an entirely different kind of night. And through all of it, one thing remained quietly constant, the sense that a river never hurries, and yet a river always arrives. It moves at exactly the pace the land allows, and no faster, trusting the slow, steady pull of gravity to carry it, eventually, to wherever it is going. There is a great deal of comfort available in that idea if you would like to borrow a little of it for yourself tonight. You do not need to rush towards sleep. You do not need to force anything. You can simply allow yourself to move gently, at whatever pace feels natural, trusting that rest will arrive in its own time, the way it always has before. If tonight's journey brought you even a little comfort, I would love for you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps this small, calm corner of the internet find its way to other tired minds who might need it too. Let the images of rivers soften now. Let the mountains and the deltas and the quiet ice-covered winter waters blur gently at the edges, the way a landscape blurs when your eyes are almost closed. Let your thoughts loosen their grip, one by one, the way a hand slowly unclenches after finally setting something down. Let your breathing settle into its own slow, unhurried rhythm, moving the way a river moves, following the path of least resistance, all the way down into rest. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Sleep well and good night.